Welcome to the new Cyber Frontier, bringing you the latest news on the local Colorado economy and initiatives that focus on the development of cybersecurity economics. You don't have to be a computer or cybersecurity expert to get plugged in. Your host, Chris Gorog, brings it straightforward, asks the tough questions, and brings the cyber world to a level of understanding for everyone. Chris is personable and opens up with our guests on issues we all would like to see addressed. You can find us on the web at www.newcyberfrontier.com. Now join our host as he introduces the topic for today's new Cyber Frontier.
Hello, this is Abe Thompson coming to you on the new Cyber Frontier podcast. I'm coming to you from the SecureSet studios here in Colorado Springs. On today's podcast, I have the distinct privilege of having Dr. Richard White, the director of the UCCS Cyber Security Programs here in Colorado Springs. Dr. White, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Abe. It's good to be here, and please call me Rick.
I shall. Academia for so long. So, Rick, how did you tell me about your journey, both in cybersecurity and professionally, and kind of how you ended up where you are today?
Well, it's been a long, winding road.
Sure.
I started my career right out of college in the Air Force as a comm computer person, and
Sure.
I spent 20 years in the Air Force, worked my way backwards from the Pentagon to the Air Force Academy.
Blessing.
Very interesting along the way, did a lot of good stuff. I started out programming nuclear cruise missiles. I was a network engineer designing and developing networks in the early days in the early 90s. And I got to work with the Luftwaffe in Germany.
Wow. Ausgezeichnet.
Sehr gut. And while I was there, I got to deploy to Operation Provide Comfort, and I was the director
Sure.
of communications for 4 months out of Incirlik, Turkey.
Okay.
And then I came back to the U.S., and they sent me to Colorado Springs. And my first 3 years were in Cheyenne Mountain. I was the deputy commander for all the comms up in Cheyenne Mountain for 3 years. And then I spent my last 4 years teaching at the Air Force Academy.
Wow, what a neat journey. Education, compassion, big joint operations, etc. Certainly a lot to draw some great lessons from, I would presume, in your current role as an educator.
Well, education I've learned through experience. My wife is the professional educator. She's actually she actually holds a degree. So I'll do stuff in the classroom, and she'll tell me what I'm doing, and so it works out pretty well. But perhaps my claim to fame is that as a brand new second lieutenant, I met my commanding officer, 2-star general, and he happened to have this paperweight on the corner of his desk, and it caught my attention, and he said, "You know what that is?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "Well, that's the computer chip that went bad in the computers in Cheyenne Mountain, and it sent out a false alert telling us we were under attack by the Russians." And I was on the floor that day when it happened, and fortunately cooler heads prevailed, and they didn't flush the bombers or take any action, and things were fine. Well, fast forward my career 17 years or 14 years later, and I was decommissioning that computer. And so I have the on-off button. I kept it to the computer that almost started World War III.
Oh my goodness.
And you may be familiar with it. The incidents that happened in the late 70s, early 80s ended up in a movie called War Games.
Yes, indeed. Shall we play a game? Put my hometown city here on the map with all that. So I'm sure it was absolutely realistic in all of its glory. That was Matthew Broderick, right?
It was.
It was. Did he play you actually? Or?
No.
Okay.
But the only thing we have in common now is that we're both old and fat. So.
Oh dear. So some fun stories, and actually, one of the things I've learned in education too is that a lot of our chore, our privilege, is bringing our narrative with us. And in your case, that narrative has been built through stories like that and other things. So tell me about your current position at UCCS. What's the charter? What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, I was hired back in November because last year the state legislature was very generous with a number of universities and colleges in the state, and we were the recipient of a $8.4 million grant over 3 years, so that's $2.8 million a year for 3 years. And I was hired to administer that grant on behalf of the provost and the chancellor. And so the state legislature, the legislation that authorized that funding, did so because it's trying to address problems that we're facing not just in the state but across the nation in cybersecurity. Sure. One of their primary concerns is the shortage of qualified people in the workforce. Oh, sure. The state, according to last statistics I saw, has a shortfall of about 10,000 positions in cybersecurity that they can't fill. And across the country, according to the Department of Labor, there's about some 300,000 positions that have gone unfilled.
That is an astronomical number. Let's take a quick break and hear from our sponsor.
We'll be right back with the rest of today's show right after these brief messages from our sponsors. Cyber Resilience Institute helps build strong cyber communities designed to prevent members from attack. Like building a neighborhood watch, it takes coordination and a sharing community to protect our identities and valuables in the virtual world. Typically, we hear that organizations know they need to do something to protect their cyber assets, but don't know where to begin. Let Cyber Resilience Institute help your community create an action plan. Cyber Resilience Institute will build your community or business marketplace so that it is designed to support a collective cyber defense. Contact them for more information at cyberresilienceinstitute.org.
This is Abe Thompson back with New Cyber Frontier. I have Dr. Rick White here with me, and we're discussing some shortfalls in the cybersecurity workforce. You were just quoting a number to me, 300,000 nationwide, is that right?
Nationwide. And so the state legislation that gave us this money, they want us to use it to develop the workforce and help fill some of those gaps and get more people into the cybersecurity profession. The other thing they want us to do, according to the legislation, is to do research and development and solve some of the problems. They're particularly interested in applications for blockchain. Sure. And I understand you were just interviewing Chris Gorog, who happens to be our resident expert in blockchain currently with Colorado Technical University. Sure. He helped write some of this legislation. So we have programmed the money. The $2.8 million that the university receives every year, we give $1 million to our partner, the National Cyber Security Center. Right. And they take $1 million off the top, and that gives us $1.8 million each year. And so we have gone ahead and programmed that $1.8 million over 3 years, the $5.4 million, to get our ducks in line so that we can report back at the end of 3 years what we've done for the state. And conceivably, if we've done a good enough job, they will continue the funding. And definitely we want to do that, but we also want to do good by the state.
Naturally, and hopefully that perpetuity would provide far-reaching benefits. So does the current execution of that role allow you any time in some of the normal academic pursuits inside the classroom there at UCCS, as I'm sure you'd love?
I continue to teach as an adjunct instructor. I teach, in the fall, I teach a course in computer ethics. Great. And in the spring, I teach a senior level course and graduate level course combined called HomeLand Security and Cyber Security. It is, in fact, HomeLand Security that got me where I am right now. When I was teaching up at the academy, it was customary in the morning classes to watch CNN before we started class, just catch up on current events. And I was teaching on Tuesday, September 11, 2001, when we were watching CNN and that first airplane went into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And at first we thought it was a horrible accident. Airplanes have crashed into tall buildings before. Back in 1947, I think it was, a B-17 Mitchell bomber ran into the Empire State Building. It was 15 minutes later when that second airplane crashed in the South Tower. We knew we were under attack. And it prompted a lot of questions because we were in the business of national security, and all of a sudden we were confronted with this new term called HomeLand Security. And it was my curiosity about what was HomeLand Security, what is it all about, and what makes it different from national security that got me interested. And so after I retired, for a while we formed a company that went about teaching the intel agencies about the military because they were hiring up a bunch of new staff to meet the new requirements. And the new people that were coming on board who were hired to support the military had no military background, and we were teaching them DoD 101. And after a while I got into teaching for University of Colorado Springs, and I started teaching Homeland Security courses because I produced one of the earliest books on Homeland Security back in 2005. And we continued to keep it updated, and the third edition came out in 2015, and we're about to undergo the next revision in 2020.
Wow, I mean, some significant bookends. When you look at all the memories that we have of that fateful day, and strangely, a good number of folks on the Navy and the military side that were impacted at the Pentagon were sort of in the precursors to the work that we're doing today in security and intelligence and cybersecurity in particular.
But what was interesting and what I learned was that Homeland Security began 6 years before 9/11 with the 1995 Tokyo subway attacks. That's when Homeland Security came about, and the concern was non-state actors with weapons of mass destruction. Yeah. The basic scenario was a suitcase nuclear bomb and detonated it in a large city. That's predicated because of the sarin gas attacks that were precipitated in Tokyo in 1995, and it was a big threshold, unprecedented event because it was the first time that a non-state actor deployed a weapon of mass destruction, in this case a chemical weapon, sarin gas. Fortunately, it didn't cause the mass effects because of the way they deployed it, but still, it was significant, and it caught the attention of security establishments around the world, including the United States. So long before 9/11 ever happened, we realized the vulnerability and the threats. And the concern was that all of our national security was oriented towards nation states. And they weren't so good against non-state actors because nation states can be influenced by deterrent measures. Non-state actors, not so much, especially if they're bent on suicide attacks. So what was interesting about it was that after the 1995 Tokyo subway attacks, both the White House and Congress, they impaneled a lot of commissions to look at how do we counter this new threat. And one of the commissions reported back in 1997 that their biggest concern was cyber attack. Now, 1997, the internet was still in its relative infancy. We had less than 70 million people worldwide on the internet. Tim Berners-Lee had just invented HTML not more than 5 years earlier. Today we have over 4 billion people on the internet. More than 60% of the planet is connected, but back then less than 1% was connected. And so for this report in 1997 to say cyber attack was a major concern was very far-sighted. Unfortunately, it got kind of forgotten after 9/11 because 9/11 was a physical attack, and we were It was a kinetic attack, and everybody was concerned about preventing another 9/11. But in 2010, it came back to the forefront. When the Department of Homeland Security was created, cyber security was part of its cornerstone missions. It just was subordinated until 2010. The 2010 Homeland Security Quadrennial Review elevated it. And when I had a chance to ask one of the directors at Department of Homeland Security what caused it to come back up, he identified 3 different incidents. 2 I knew about, and 1 I was kind of surprised to learn. The one was Stuxnet. The other was Sony. I think it happened about that time. But the other one was the Russian invasion of Georgia. And when Russia invaded, prior to commencing their kinetic operations, if you will, they had froze the Georgian command and control system through cyber attack. And that's what caught the U.S. attention, and that's when cyber attack became a big concern. But my last thing I'll say, I apologize for going on so long, is a lot of people say, well, so what is the connection between Homeland Security and cybersecurity? And this is what I teach in my course, which is cybersecurity is essential to protecting critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure protection is essential to safeguarding the nation from domestic catastrophic destruction, and that is Homeland Security.
Positively. Let's take a quick break and hear from our sponsor.
We'll be right back with the rest of today's show right after these brief messages from our sponsors. Cyber Resilience Institute helps build strong cyber communities designed to prevent members from attack. Like building a neighborhood watch, it takes coordination and a sharing community to protect our identities and valuables in the virtual world. Typically, we hear that organizations know they need to do something to protect their cyber assets, but don't know where to begin. Let Cyber Resilience Institute help your community create an action plan. Cyber Resilience Institute will build your community or business marketplace so that it is designed to support a collective cyber defense. Contact them for more information at cyberresilienceinstitute.org.
This is Abe Thompson back with New Cyber Frontier here out of the SecureSet studios here in Colorado Springs. I'm with Dr. Rick White, who's currently the Director of Cyber Security Programs at UCCS in Colorado Springs. Fascinating narrative, and you're giving us that historical perspective as we've developed this concept of Homeland Security. Back in '97, as you talked about, I was with a 3-letter agency in Fort Meade, addressing some of the same things, working with the law enforcement agencies to even find out what cyber crime was in its infancy and bringing cyber to the fore. And then, even you mentioned Tokyo, a lot of these things hit very close to home. I was stationed in Japan at the time, and it was a very real scenario. But you've drawn us back to what is, another great essential, greatly important essential component, and that is the critical infrastructure. And even that terminology and recognition of its vulnerability has been key in this development.
Well, the recognition that cyber attack is a major threat. So what's changed in our world is that it used to be that domestic catastrophic destruction could only be caused by nature or nations. What happened when Aum Shinrikyo got a hold of CERN is that it was the first time that non-state actors now could wield the power that was once reserved to nation states.
Force multiplier.
It is, and in another sense, cyber attack is the same way. What happened on 9/11 was that 19 hijackers subverted the transportation infrastructure, turning passenger jets into guided missiles, and what they were able to do, what they demonstrated was the ability to achieve WMD effects without WMD by subverting critical infrastructure. And that got a lot of attention. Well, the same thing can be done with a coordinated cyber attack. And the 3 scenarios that keep security experts awake at night that have been studied at the highest levels are 1, shutting down the North American grid. 2, is multiple simultaneous meltdowns of nuclear power plants. And number three is undermining the Federal Reserve. Any one of those scenarios could precipitate the worst disaster in U.S. history outside of the Civil War. In the Civil War, 610,000 Americans died on both sides of that conflict, more than in every other war combined.
American hands, unfortunately.
Correct. So that's warfare as domestic catastrophic destruction. But outside warfare and disasters, either natural or man-made, the biggest natural disaster in U.S. history was the 1900 Galveston hurricane, in which an estimate between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. That could be dwarfed by a coordinated cyber attack. The estimates, if we lost the North American grid, are mind-boggling, and it's hard to get a grip on it. But so I look at it this way: to get an estimate of how many lives could be lost in a situation like that, I go back to the 2003 European heat wave. In 2003, Europe was in August 2003. The continent was engulfed in a heat wave, and a lot of people didn't have air conditioning. Well, equate that to a cyber attack in the summer, and you have no air conditioning. 70,000 Europeans lost their lives due to no air conditioning, due to heat exhaustion. And that was just in Europe. Imagine taking that and multiplying it across the United States. And that's not just the only thing, because if you eliminate electricity, which is a lifeline infrastructure upon which most other infrastructure depends, then you have cascading effects. That means no refrigeration, no medicine, no food, no gas. The entire
medical devices, etc.
Everything comes to a halt. And so, and there's no islands of electricity. Initially, for maybe the first week, those with generators can continue on. But a cyber attack that destroys the baseline generators would be one that would last for months, possibly years, because the U.S. no longer makes the baseline generators. We have to order them from out of country. And to order them and get them built and delivered is a long time.
Right. And that's, we certainly had many wake-up calls on a smaller scale to the power grid issue you describe. I remember in San Diego, we had the barbecued squirrel or possum or raccoon, whatever it is, that literally brought SDG&E, I believe, and Edison to their knees. It's just a glaring vulnerability by such a small entity. And yet we're talking about a coordinated, intelligent, distributed attack potential. Now, in presenting, these concerns and in the study, what have we learned and how have we prepared?
Well, it's a long road, and you and me as ratepayers, we pay our electric bills every month. We should be thankful that it's a long road, because we can't afford to do everything that needs to be done overnight to fix everything. So I worked in Cheyenne Mountain for 3 years. I know what it's like I know what protected infrastructure looks like. You bury everything, you harden everything, you put in line spares and everything. We can't afford that. But as the electric grid is updated and replaced, so all infrastructure goes through the life cycle. It's installed, it's maintained, it's replaced. That cycle takes decades, and before it's all redone, it could be 100 years. But in that time, originally it was installed with no concern about deliberate attack. Now we've got that in hindsight. We can do that. The key technology, at least with the electric grid, and is called segmentation.
Yeah.
Break the big grids into smaller grids so that we don't have as many cascading effects, and we can contain the damages so that a tree falling in Ohio doesn't cause a blackout across the northeast United States as it did in 2003 and into Canada. So over time, we can make this infrastructure less vulnerable to malicious attack. It'll never be perfect. In fact, here's the thing about cyber attack. Today there is no cure. There is no cure to cyber attack. So there are no silver bullets. That's why in absence of a cure, we're relegated to continual vigilance.
Yeah, mitigation.
And so in the absence of a cure, but even if you have no cure to cyber attack, every disaster goes through 4 phases: prevent, protect, before an attack, respond and recover after an attack. Since we can't stop an attack, you can't stop a determined attacker any more than you can stop a hurricane. Since you can't stop that, the one control you have is respond and recover. Respond contains the damages. That's what segmentation is about. And recover is get back to operations as quickly as possible. Not 100%, but functional. If we can reduce that timeline to a point that the lights blink because there's been a major cyber attack versus blacking out the entire United States, then we may not have cured cyber attack, but we've rendered the consequences negligible to the point that we don't care.
Yeah. Well, and we'll need to care, in the future. But we have certainly learned a great deal over time and implemented those things. And I love this idea that you talk about in terms of segmentation. It reminds me of developing, FOBs for forward operating bases that we can draw back to, at least. And that does present, I think, a lot more hope than you hear a lot of folks talk about.
Well, my approach in Homeland Security is rather unique. Not contained just to myself. I don't hold the copyright on this idea, but if you ask most Americans today what is Homeland Security, they'll tell you it's something about terrorism. And I say no. Terrorism is a potential cause. It's a crime uniquely distinguished by motive. Title 18, Section 2331 of U.S. Code. They say there's no definition of terrorism, but Title 18, Section 2331 says that if you commit a violent act for the purpose of coercing government, then you have committed a terrorist act. So since you can be arrested for that, I'll say that's a pretty good definition of terrorism. But that's a motive for violence. What if you don't want to overturn the U.S. government or coerce it? You just want to prove a point and shut down the North American electric grid, or for other reasons so terrorism may precipitate the act, but so could an entire universe of other motives. So it's not about terrorism. It's not about the motive. It's about the effect.
Yes.
The effect of domestic catastrophic destruction, either by nature or man. That is what Homeland Security is about. Now, from the man-made side of it, if you focus on eliminating vulnerabilities to your infrastructure, you reduce the opportunities. If you sequester the agents for weapons of mass destruction, you reduce the opportunities. So if you my approach to Homeland Security is that Homeland Security is a technical problem.
Yeah.
If we can sequester the agents of weapons of mass destruction, if we can eliminate the vulnerabilities to our critical infrastructure, then we eliminate the means for creating domestic catastrophic destruction. So it may take decades, it may take 100 years, but by this approach, there's an eventual end to Homeland Security.
Sure.
Because you eliminate the means and opportunity for a hostile agent to commit a crime. And if you need 3 things to commit a crime: means, motive, and opportunity. If you take away just one of them, then you don't have the ability to commit a crime.
And you truly hardened, as we would say, probably in the more DoD sense, you've hardened your target.
Right.
And it becomes unappealing.
Right. And that becomes the answer to Homeland Security versus the approach on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic, and it will always be with us. It's a tactic used by those who are disenfranchised or disaffected for some means. Well, there'll always be people who feel like that they've been driven to the point they have to use violence to make their point. And so from that standpoint, terrorism or Homeland Security will never be solved. But from a technical standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, it can't be solved. But from a technical standpoint, it can. Social problems are hard. Technical problems are easy.
Yeah, and you've really presented, I think, something that I hope catches on. It's a hopeful notion, because oftentimes we in the cybersecurity sector get accused of being harbingers of doom rather than purveyors of hope and solutions. And you really speak to something that I definitely want to hear more about. I definitely want to continue a conversation with you. Would you be interested in coming back at some point?
Yes,
Hopefully.
definitely.
This has been a fascinating conversation with Dr. Rick White, who is the Director of Cybersecurity Programs at the University of Colorado Springs. Dr. White, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abe.
This is Abe Thompson with the new Cyber Frontier, coming from the SecureSet studios here in Colorado Springs. Out there in podcast land, have a good day.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of New Cyber Frontier. Remember to get involved. Often we think that someone else will handle privacy and security in the virtual world, but you are the only one truly in command of your virtual fate. Join our mailing list so we can keep you informed of breaking news and new releases. If you have an idea, if you have a question that you would like to hear answered, or if you want to get involved with our efforts, reach out to us at newcyberfrontier.com. We also encourage you to visit our sponsors' links, as they are the ones that really make this show possible. I want to thank each of you for supporting the show, and we look forward to seeing you back for the next episode of New Cyber Frontier.